My spouse is familiar enough with me to guess where I'll take her to supper. She has an instinct, for example, about when I need a little tender loving care too, even though I've tried my hardest to surprise her. She is fully aware of every detail of my life, including my awkward high school flirtations and my disappointment at not getting the promotion I felt I deserved. She is aware of my extreme fear of snakes, regardless of their potential hazard. She is aware that I can't stand to hear young children cry because it makes me want to pick them up and put an arm around them. My father's inability to fully embrace me is the reason she even knows I'm like that. I entrust everything about me to my beloved wife. She is aware that I eat lunch at 11:30 every day because, as the least senior guy in the office, I was required to take a lunch break at that time of day. I used to always return at 12:30 because that's when most people wanted to leave back then. I developed the habit and didn't break it. However, as a philosopher might clarify, my spouse is unaware that I'm having an extended lunch late today. I work for a senior administrator, and the entire office is going to a farewell party for him. He is the director of the research and development branch. The entire operation was shutting down to wish Bill Thornton a happy retirement as he was retiring after 36 years. I was glad to have Lyle under my supervision because he was one of the younger engineers in my division. He was creative, very resourceful, and a hard worker. I was pleased to add his name for merit pay raises and bonuses when the time came. Lyle had purchased one of those enormous Chevy Suburbans with his first big bonus. He wanted a wagon big enough for lots of kids because he already had one and another was on the way. It seems that his spouse had the same thoughts. He was proud of his new SUV and wanted to flaunt it, but I secretly wondered if it could fit a whole clan, let alone one family. I rode shotgun on the way down to the convention center because of my seniority. Lyle said, "So, Ron, what do you think of my new buggy?" I'm Ron Masters, also known as Ronald, and I'm 29 years old. I work in mechanical engineering, but lately my job hasn't had much to do with that degree. I hadn't been a manager for very long, but it was taking up more and more of my time, and I was considering taking some night courses in personnel and resource management to keep up with the responsibilities the boss kept pushing me to take on. Or is that supposed to be hot or tight these days? It's cool, I replied, adding some excitement to my voice. I'm never able to recall the newest lingo. He laughed when I told him. You like it? I turned to look inside the roomy car and said, "Oh, hell yeah." Shoot, Lyle, I said, I think the first apartment Sherry and I lived in was smaller than this. Lyle laughed, taken aback by my remark, and I turned to face the front as he braked to a stop at a red light, realizing again how high off the road I was. The driver and passengers in his truck, as he called it, had an excellent view all around, even above most of the cars on the road. Catching movement out of the corner of my eye, I looked down out the passenger side window and was surprised to see my wife sitting in her 2-year-old Taurus beside us at the light. Sherry rarely went to this part of town because it was far from her office and she rarely had to leave during the day. As I watched, a man's hand was thrust up her skirt so far that his wrist and part of his forearm disappeared. I was staring at the controls on the door panel, trying to figure out which one lowered the window, but it was taking too long. I started to open the door and tap on my wife's car window. I felt my fingers trembling where they rested on the door handle, my gut knotting up so quickly that I was suddenly in excruciating pain. I felt disoriented, unable to think, unable to move. All I could do was watch, waiting for Sherry to shove the man's hand away, because surely this was not something she would tolerate from any man but me. I found it difficult to breathe as I watched my wife spread her legs wider, accepting the intruding fingers into her skirt. The guy she was with, whoever he was, had to have 2 or 3 fingers inside her. There was no way that length of male arm could disappear under her short skirt without his fingers in a place I thought was only mine. "Please, no," I whispered, but no one heard me. I've only passed out one time after being struck on the head by a baseball when I was 12 years old. I was feeling the same sensations I'd felt that day right now. My vision began to contract into a narrow tunnel, and a huge weight was crushing my chest. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. I'm a strong man, but the shock siphoned all my strength away. I was nothing but an empty shell. If I'd been lying across a set of railroad tracks and had only to roll to the side to avoid being run over by a train, I couldn't have done it. My eyes filled with unshed tears as I watched my wife of 4 years lean back to better enjoy this unknown man's ministrations. She never objected, never tried to get the man to stop. It came to me that this was a thing she'd enjoyed before with this man, a thing she wanted and was used to receiving. Sherry tilted her head back, her eyes closed as she lost herself in the pleasure his fingers were giving her. The look of lust and need for gratification shocked me. It was the same one she showed me when we had sex. I guess I twisted around in my seat as Lyle accelerated away from the intersection, watching my wife's Taurus as it made a right turn down a street that would take her back to her place of employment. She'd never looked up to wonder who might be watching in the big Suburban, not that she would have seen me through the dark-tinted windows, knowing that I wouldn't be out and about at this hour, as my lunch hour ended 30 minutes ago. She hadn't cared what an obscene, exhibitionistic show she and the man with her had put on for whoever it might have been. It didn't have to be me watching, it could have been anyone. Yes, my wife was well acquainted with me, but it seemed that I only thought that about her. That night, when she got home, I received a quick peck on the cheek. My memory told me that a few years prior, after a particularly trying day at work, I'd received long, passionate kisses at the door. But somewhere along the line, those kisses stopped coming until they disappeared entirely. My spouse was walking up the stairs when I suddenly realized something was missing. I hadn't noticed it when I watched her perform in traffic earlier in the day. "Sherry," I blurted, "what the heck happened to your pantyhose? You definitely put on a new pair this morning, I'm sure of it. Why aren't you wearing any now?" After a long moment of hesitation, she walked down the hallway to her bedroom and turned around to face me. "Oh, I got a runner in the right leg," she finally said. "It kept on growing and growing, and I finally just took them off," she said. She smiled back at me, looking at me more intently than I think she would have under normal circumstances, as if she needed to know if I was buying her explanation. I nodded understandingly, and she turned away, but not before I noticed a small look of relief cross her face. I didn't plan to say anything, but an unexpected wave of pain and rage took hold of my tongue and forced me to inquire about the pantyhose. The two emotions still controlled me, and an evil imp drove me to see how far I could irritate my beloved wife. "I see," I said, trying to sound more playful. I observed her response and remarked, "I thought some guy might have ripped them off because he was in a hurry to get into your panties." She was fine, the only thing noticeable was a minor tensing of her body. "What on earth caused that?" she asked questioningly. "It's been known to happen," I shrugged, trying to keep my hurt and anger from showing in my eyes as I gave her a blank stare. "You remember Katie, that girl I had to fire last year after she got caught screwing one of the men on the loading dock? Well, I do remember her frequently returning from lunches and breaks without her pantyhose and thigh-high stockings on. Naturally, that was prior to my awareness of the situation." I shrugged and averted my gaze, attempting to portray a man recalling a traumatic experience. Sherry nibbled at her bottom lip for a few seconds before approaching me. She stepped close, her palms flat on my lower ribs, sweeping them up my chest in a slow caress before she threw her arms around my neck, pulling my head down and meeting my lips for a few tease-inducing seconds. "Honey," she said earnestly when she eventually broke off the kiss. It broke my heart all over again. She'd been lying by omission all along, and now she was lying to my face. It was a raw, calculating thing to do, born of deception and reared by cruelty. I'd hoped, well, I didn't know what I hoped for. I guess I thought that if I got a confession from her, we'd find some way to get past this, even if I had no idea how. If you love someone, though, it's hard to let go without one last attempt. But Sherry was waiting for an answer. "I know that, sweetheart," I said, trying to sound as sincere as possible. She wrecked her marriage, the other guy's marriage, and her life all for a little stupid, dirty sex out behind the warehouse. Her husband had thrown her out and gained custody of both of their children. Sherry winced slightly, nearly imperceptibly, but her face remained unchanged. Sherry continued, "Well, she deserved it, and the lie was now complete. My dear wife believed that she was exempt from the same constraints that applied to others." I grasped her wrists firmly and yanked her arms away from my neck. I gave her a level gaze and gave her a soft peck on the lips. Grasping one shoulder with each hand, I spun her around and gave her a slap on her adorable little behind. It no longer belonged to me. The fact that she disliked even light spankings was irrelevant now. Now, go get changed. I'll have dinner on the table in 10 minutes, I advised her. I ignored him and went into the kitchen, not turning around. I didn't know what to do at first. I had no idea what I ought to do. How should a husband respond when he finds out his spouse is having an extramarital affair? I'm afraid that for the next week and a half, I didn't do much work for the company. I couldn't even tell how long I'd been staring into space when I would suddenly find myself working on something. Many employees have asked me if something is wrong, and I have always said that there isn't. I had no one to support me through this. It would be up to me to figure out the riddle. In a few cases, I was able to use logic to my advantage. First of all, the fact that he was at ease caressing my wife in public suggested they had been having sex for a while. He would still be much more hesitant if they were just getting to know one another. It indicated that Sherry had been unfaithful to me for a while. I questioned when it had started. There were no indications that I could recall of her cheating on me. I couldn't think of any adjustments to our daily routine or shifts in attitude. Ultimately, though, the length of time it had lasted was not really relevant. The fact that it was occurring was the only significant element. Secondly, I refused to tolerate her adultery. I refused to leave my house every morning wondering who Shia was going to screw that particular day. In any case, I was not much of a churchgoer. Turning the other cheek was not an option for me. I wasn't capable of doing that. I saw no use in attempting to keep the marriage intact. Throughout our 4 years of marriage, Sherry had betrayed the trust that we had developed. Based on the evidence, it appeared to me that she had broken it several times, and I was unsure of how it could ever be repaired. Confronting her was the only logical thing left to do in order to salvage as much of my sanity as possible from this situation. Maybe Shia would tell me if there was something I'd done so horribly wrong to cause her to react in this way. I made an attempt to yank my gaze back through the windows that I had been staring through. I never felt more alone in my entire life. The pain came in icy waves punctuated by bursts of rage. I couldn't stay in either feeling long enough to get any work done. I resolved that my marriage to Sherry was over, and I gave myself the grim assignment of locating a rapid means of escaping my suffering. The problem was, Sherry would probably be able to take damn near everything we'd come up with without some sort of proof. In the 21st century, Texas courts are not sympathetic to a man leveling unfounded accusations against his wife. Women were generally given the benefit of the doubt. I closed my mind's door and pushed aside any remaining love I might have had for Sherry. I made the decision to take my fair part of what we owned. The house had some decent equity, and the savings account was starting to balance out. After a year or so, we were finally both earning a respectable income, which allowed us to purchase some high-quality appliances and furniture. Although we had been making balloon payments and the loans were almost paid off, the cars had both been financed. I had to catch her red-handed if I wanted a fair share of what we'd amassed. I kept an eye out for a chance. Sherry told me on Tuesday that she was going out with her girlfriends on Friday night for a few drinks and lots of gossip, just 1 day shy of 3 weeks after I'd witnessed her playing with some jerk. She mentioned that she did it roughly every 6 weeks with a group of 6 other women in her social circle. Sherry's best friend Melissa was not on board, unlike Connie, Barbara, Miranda, Colleen, Tammy, and Miranda. They planned to gather as much information as they could to discuss Melissa behind her back. When Sherry told me that, she giggled a little. There was nothing at all strange about her doing this, she had done it on several, widely spaced occasions over the years. But I knew deep down that this one was unique. I couldn't see anything in her behavior that indicated she was not actually going to do exactly what she told me, but I didn't trust her anymore. I had to verify what she was saying, I said with a grin on my face. One of my wife's friends was Connie. She and her husband, Art, occasionally came over to our former home for dinner parties and cookouts. "Hey, Tiger," she said with joy. Connie enjoyed flirting and seized the chance whenever she could. She inquired, "What's up?" "Not really," I replied. "I was just wondering if you and Tom have any plans for Friday night, tomorrow evening. I was thinking the four of us might get together for dinner and some cards." She uttered in a mockingly alluring tone. There was a brief pause, but not long enough for her to be checking anything. "I'll have to check my busy calendar, big boy." "No, nothing on tap for that night, sugar," she replied. "I'll have to check with Tom, but I think it sounds like a great idea. What shall we bring?" I tried to sound positive, but on the inside, I was dead. "Just your cute little self, your better half, and a pair of bright smiles." "I quit," I said. Over the past few weeks, all of my pleasure had vanished from my life. "Okay," she said. "I'll give you a call when I know for sure." "Okay," she paused briefly. "And Ron, me and Tom are sure glad you and Sherry are doing so well, sugar," she added. I frowned into empty space as I listened. "We weren't sure after the Vegas trip that you guys would be able to get things together, you know," she said in a more serious voice than I'd ever heard from her. "Vegas?" I said, a little mystified. I thought at first she was aware of Sheer String, though I didn't have an inkling how she would have known. The trip she was referring to was one I hadn't gone on because at the last minute my boss had called, needing me to go to Denver to straighten out a mess in the R&D division in our parent company. Sherry, Melissa, and her husband, Cal, Connie, and Tom had gone without me, and by all accounts, everyone had come back with small winnings for once. Wait, was Connie saying something had gone on in Vegas? Hell, she had to be, but I needed to know more. It made me sick, but I had to know. "I don't understand what you're trying to say, Connie," I said. Even I could hear the confusion in my voice. She was silent for a long time. "Oh, it's just scatterbrained me," she said. "You know how I am." "Well, listen, I'll get with Tom and check if he's already got something planned for tomorrow or not, okay?" "Sure, let me know." "All right," I replied. She said she would. I got off the phone as quickly as I decently could. I was afraid my voice would reveal the pain I was in. Half an hour later, Connie called back and apologized. Tom had obligated himself to play in a poker game at a neighbor's house. Connie was just as sorry as she could be. "Maybe next time," she said. I agreed, regretting that they couldn't come. Maybe Sherry and I would just forget about the whole thing and try again at a better time. Neither of us was fooling the other. I knew two things now: something involving my wife had occurred in Las Vegas, and Sherry was not going out with the girls tomorrow night. I had to let the former lay uninvestigated while I dealt with the latter. I've heard it said that adulterous spouses get into a mindset where they conclude they must be more intelligent than those they're cheating on, simply because they're getting away with what they're doing. They begin to believe they are cleverer than anyone else in the world because they managed to deceive their marriage partner for a time. They begin to disrespect him or her and hold their spouses in contempt eventually. So the story goes, cheaters start making mistakes because of overconfidence. They don't think anyone else has the smarts to catch them. I didn't know about all that. This was my first experience dealing with such a thing. But I did know that Sherry was making mistakes. If I hadn't seen her that day with that sorry excuse for a man in her car at the stoplight, I'd have caught on to her activities eventually anyway. Being in public with that man was a bad mistake. Any one of our friends or neighbors could have been in a van or SUV beside her car. It didn't have to be me. Not making sure Connie would cover for her was another blunder, a major one. Second, she knew I was friendly with Connie and Tom, even more so with Melissa and Cal. Whatever happened in Vegas was almost certainly known by both couples. Either of them might have called me sometime to give her up. These were loose ends she should have tied up somehow. Her third error was assuming I still trusted her and would stay home like a good little boy while she was out whoring around. Her fourth was thinking I would put up with a cheating 304 of a wife. I smashed my fist down on the coffee table beside me, making the lamp dance around on its base. For a long moment, Sherry was in the shower. She didn't hear a thing. I massaged my hand and wrist, seething inside as I contemplated my wife's betrayal of our marriage, herself, and me. I was worried that my anger was going to take over my whole life. It seemed to me that my jaws were always clenched tight these days, and my pulse pounded whenever I thought of what Sherry and that guy were doing. I was ruthlessly suppressing those feelings when I was around her. It only made the rage burn that much hotter. The sad thing was that I was actually a little relieved when it became clear tonight was to be their next little get-together for sex. I hated to admit that to myself, but I was. Once I got through whatever I had to face this evening, I'd take what I knew and put it in the hands of my attorney. I had him primed and ready to file charges whenever I gave him the go-ahead. Sherry left a little after 7 o'clock, just as twilight was beginning to cast soft shadows all around. She thought I was in the garage straightening up the disorder that accumulates if one doesn't give it constant attention, but I was really just killing time, waiting for her to leave. Now that the evening had come, I was anxious to get things over with and move on with my life. Sherry hadn't been interested enough about what I was doing to come outside for a look, much less to spend any time with me. I guess she was just happy I was out of her way so she could get ready for her date or whatever she was calling it. That was fine with me. If she'd come out to be with me, she'd have seen the rental limo I'd arranged for that morning. I hadn't wanted to park the shabby-looking wreck on the street. It might have been towed as an abandoned vehicle. It was a small lie, I suppose, hiding the rental's existence. That's what's wrong with lying and cheating. The lies begin to take on a life of their own and reproduce more of their kind spontaneously. There were 3 more lies told as she walked out the door. I wished her a good time, and we both said we loved each other. A man and a woman who loved each other wouldn't be doing the things to each other that we were going to do tonight, I told myself. I didn't care. When she was far enough down the block not to be able to see inside the garage, I opened the outside side door and jumped in the rental car, driving away. I pointed the remote over my shoulder to close the door and sped down our residential street to make sure I didn't lose contact with her. Paradoxically, I had to slow drastically when I saw her ahead, waiting at a stoplight for cross-traffic to clear. I had to pull to the curb and stop for a bit, or I'd have gotten too close. As it turned out, following her didn't prove to be that big a problem. Like most drivers, she paid almost no attention to the traffic behind her, and even if she had, she wouldn't have known to look for a beat-up 8-year-old grey Chrysler sedan. She had no idea that her husband was in that vehicle tonight, trailing her half a city block behind. The light was still good enough for me to be able to identify her vehicle, but it was gradually getting darker. It gave me an excuse to turn on my headlights. If she were to look back, she wouldn't be able to see my face past the glare. I followed her through thinning traffic to the far southwest side of town and watched her pull into a moderately priced motel. I quickly found a space across the street and parallel parked my ratty old vehicle, getting my camera ready and trying to settle my jangled nerves. I watched out the driver's side window while my wife sat in her car for 5 minutes or so. It seemed she was impatient. She made a series of quick calls on her cell phone. Mine didn't ring. It was not me she was calling. A few minutes later, a big dark blue SUV came down the street and turned into the motel. I could see the driver was a male, but he was going too fast for me to get a good look at him. He parked beside my wife's Taurus, and they both got out shortly. The guy had my wife in a tight embrace and was kissing her hungrily. After a bit, she patted his chest and pulled back a little. I bought a Nikon Diode Z1 digital camera when I started planning this operation a couple of weeks ago. Even with my limited experience with digital cameras, it looked like this camera was going to be perfect for the job I had to do. I started snapping away, taking pictures of my cheating wife and the guy she was screwing. Though twilight was fading into night, there was still enough illumination under the motel's exterior lighting to light up both of them. The camera's 10x optical zoom, multiplied by its 4x digital zoom, gave me superb close-ups of his hand in her shirt. I could have counted the freckles on my lovely wife's face if I'd been in accounting mode. My only real problem was keeping the camera steady enough. I solved that by scrunching down low, rolling down the window, and bracing the camera on the 2 inches of glass that refused to disappear into the door. Neither of the cheaters across the way noticed me, though I was less than 50 yards away under a streetlight. They were awfully careless. I guess it was true that cheaters begin believing they don't have to take elementary precautions because they can't be caught. The guy produced one of those plastic cards with the magnetic strip on the back and opened the motel room door. He and my wife went inside, and I settled back to wait them out. I wanted some pictures of them leaving the room to show how long they'd been inside. The camera had the ability to insert a date stamp on the face of the digital pictures, and the downloaded .jpg file would show the precise date and time it was saved in the camera. I thought a computer expert would explain such things well enough so any court could understand it. Even if the judge wouldn't accept my explanation, I was sure my attorney would be able to find and hire such an expert. My stomach was churning, the bitter taste of bile was in my mouth. I was barely able to control stomach contractions that kept threatening to force partially digested bits back up my esophagus. The longer I waited, the worse it got. Abruptly, I couldn't hold it back any longer. I wrenched the car door open and spewed an ugly pool of nastiness out onto the pavement. The flood kept regenerating itself long after I thought I'd brought up everything I'd eaten for the last several days. After a minute or two, though, there was nothing more in my stomach. It got painful, then the dry heaves continued for another eternity before gradually dying away. I wiped my mouth on my handkerchief, rinsed my mouth out, and drank a half-liter bottle of water, shaking with anger, humiliation, and a feeling of loss so strong I could barely stand it. I stepped over the mess in the street and walked a few yards up and down the curb to see if it would help settle me down. I glanced at the room door over there, making sure they hadn't come out yet. I stopped in my tracks. There was only a dim glow coming through most of the drawn curtains, but at one place down low on the left side, there was a small area where the light came through more brightly. I was intrigued. I looked all around to make sure I was unobserved, then I crossed the street and walked through the motel parking lot. From a few feet away, I could see that my dear wife and the sorry asshole who was with her had been inexcusably sloppy for two people doing something they shouldn't. They left a space a couple of inches across where the curtain had not quite been pulled close. I glanced around again, checking to see if anyone could see what I was about to do. I decided that I really didn't care what anyone else thought. Even if someone did see me, this was an opportunity to photograph these two red-handed, and I was going to take it. I knelt on one knee and eased the camera up to the window, aiming it through the opening in the drapes. The LCD screen on the back of the camera lit up when I pressed the power button, and I had my proof. My wife was on all fours on the bed, with a short, stocky man with blonde hair getting into position behind her. He was, I guess, the kind of man women thought of as handsome. He looked to be a little younger than me, but it was hard to tell. My hands were trembling too badly for the camera to focus properly, and I had to press the lens against the window. It took some experimentation to get a good series of pics. If I let too much of a gap develop between the window and lens, the harsh brightness of the lights out here reflected off the glass and tended to wash everything out. In a minute or two, though, I had everything I needed. Inside the room, I could see the guy beginning to drill my wife. He wasn't gentle about it, but it appeared Sherry had developed a taste for a little rough sex because her face was screwed up in a mask of lust and illicit pleasure. The camera could take 6 pictures in a fast sequence, and I put it on that setting before leaving home. I pressed the shutter release button again and again. I couldn't take too much of watching them, still badly nauseated and feeling more pain inside than I'd known since my parents died. I settled back on my haunches and tried to get myself together. I drew a ragged breath and closed my eyes tight to fight back the tears I refused to shed. I hurt, but a human being can only hurt so long before they shift themselves to another place. I pushed my emotions aside, damming them up and putting them back behind that door I thought I had closed on them earlier in the week. Suddenly, there was no more love when I thought of her, and I damn sure didn't like her at all. My new remoteness, my detached view, gave me the strength to get to my feet without swaying or feeling sick to my stomach. There was a sudden flurry of loud voices from inside the room. I could hear Sherry, but I couldn't tell what she was saying. Then there was a louder shriek a second or two later, but it sounded like a man. I didn't know any men who admitted to being screamers during sex, but I guess they could. Anyway, the suddenly noisy sex play got me on my feet and moving away. I was afraid it would attract someone to come see what was going on. I started to walk back to my rental across the street, but I paused behind the son of a bitch's car while I thought. For a long moment, I turned and walked down the sidewalk past all the motel doors. I looked carefully under the eaves, then stepped away from the building to examine the roof and every light pole in sight. I was looking for any outside security cameras the motel might have. I found a place down at the far corner of the structure where there were some unconnected wires and an empty mounting bracket, but I didn't see any cameras. I crossed the parking lot and stood next to the rental car, looking at the empty, abandoned restaurant. There were surely no spy cameras over there. There were some apartment buildings I could see down this side street, but they were far away on the main thoroughfare. I couldn't see any businesses that would logically be protected by surveillance cameras pointed in this direction. I made sure the cap was securely fastened over the lens and put my camera in the back seat for safekeeping. Walking purposefully, I went back to where my wife and whoever he was were parked. I pulled the pocket knife out of my jeans and opened it while I debated with myself the wisdom of doing what I was thinking. Then I shrugged and bent low beside Loverboy's rear tires. It took a stronger thrust than I thought it would, but I soon found the right amount of velocity and power to shove the blade deep into the tire. I was afraid my grip would slip and I'd cut myself badly, but that didn't happen. The hissing of the air escaping from the expensive set of tires seemed terribly loud, but no one came out to investigate. Encouraged, I took care of all 4 tires on his SUV and then all of my wife's tires too. I guess it was a childish gesture. It didn't solve anything, and it very well could make it clear to the cheating duo that someone was onto them. I decided they wouldn't think that, they were too cocky. I wanted to do more, but I didn't. 100 years ago, I could have smashed down the door and put a bullet in each of their brains, and no jury would have ever convicted me. 200 years ago, I could have challenged him to a duel and killed him in front of his friends and family. Those were acceptable ways back then for a man to salvage his honor in situations like this. But we're so much more civilized now, a cuck has so few options open to him these days. I did what I could, feeling a little better and not in the least guilty about the damage I'd done. I walked back to my rental and got in, slamming the door and not caring if anyone heard. I'd taken the first steps to rid myself of a faithless wife and regain some self-respect. There was little remaining yet to do. Monday would come soon, and I'd have a long talk with my lawyer. Sunday comes before Monday though, and Saturday before that. Sherry came home well before midnight, pissed off because some SB had slashed the tires on her car outside the club. 3 teens had been seen running away, she said. Then she'd had to wait 3 hours for the AAA folks to get there. Apparently, I'd not been observed by other tires on the cars, and someone else was suspected. I actually had no idea whether the 3-teen story had any legitimacy, but the 3-hour wait sounded about right. I shrugged, none of it mattered in the least. I was surprised she was home that early though. I thought she'd be out a lot later with her sex toy. If she was outside waiting for the wrecker for any time at all, it meant her tryst with the new men in her life had been a short one. Not that it made any difference. I said a few consoling words to calm her down. She got in bed and went to sleep shortly after coming in. She hadn't wanted any cuddling, I knew why. The odor of cheap motel soap on her body was strong enough to make me gag. Sunday afternoon and evening, Sherry got very affectionate and wanted me close to her. It was impossible to tell from looking at her that she'd been out screwing some other man on Friday night. She showed no sign of feeling guilty about anything at all. If anything, she was more relaxed and pleasant than she'd been in months. That, I had read, was one of the classic signs of SP is cheating. Whether they showed it or not, they usually felt some degree of guilt and would try to make it up to their dishonest spouse. I had talked to my attorney earlier today while Shia was fixing lunch. He'd said to call him at home if I needed to. He was all set, he said. All he needed was my signature on the paperwork, and he'd file them at the courthouse before noon tomorrow. The pictures were bargaining chips. If Sherry contested the divorce tomorrow afternoon, I was going to be a free man. In a sense, the divorce wouldn't actually be final for 6 months, but I'd be separated from the woman who'd brought me so much pain. That night, Sherry put on a black lawn nightgown she knew I liked and glided seductively across the carpet to where I sat on the bed. I didn't want her, not after I'd seen what I had Friday night. I was trying to come up with an excuse not to have anything to do with her tonight. I was sick to my stomach again just at the thought of touching her. I sat on the bed and tried to look uninterested. She stayed with it, though, the very image of a loving wife who wanted some loving from her husband. She moved close to me, even though I didn't want to, even though I could barely bring myself to be civil to her. Her caresses were beginning to have a visible effect on me. She smirked, knowing the power she had over me. It pissed me off. Abruptly, I changed my mind without any thought at all, much less a careful consideration of the consequences. I knew I was going to give my dear deceitful young wife the sex she wanted and more. It would be one last sex session before we separated forever. If I were rational at that moment, I would have known what I was going to try to do to her was rooted in my own humiliation. There was perhaps some arrogance mixed in also, but at the moment, all I wanted to do was exact a small measure of vengeance for the disgrace that this woman had heaped on me. Carefully, I built up an image in my mind of a street hooker. I envisioned a woman who deserved no consideration and who was nothing more than a receptacle for me to use and discard. I would use her as I pleased. When I was ready, but my revenge was going to be a little more subtle than that. If it worked, she wouldn't even understand it as retribution for a long time. I let Sherry's face blend into the faceless features of the woman I had just constructed. Having dehumanized Sherry sufficiently for my purposes, I was ready. I stood up and pulled her close. I was wild and wanted my pleasure. I did the same. She was exhausted by the time I was done with her. When her body relaxed, I let her lay there unmolested, exhausted myself. I stretched my body out on the bed beside my wife. Our only contact was my fingers around her wrist. After a while, Sherry rolled over and cuddled against me, putting her head on my shoulder. "Oh God, honey," she breathed into my chest. "If only you'd." Her voice faded away before completing whatever she'd been about to say. I didn't care anymore. I didn't ask her what she meant. "All you had to do was be here with me," I answered. I trusted it was enigmatic enough for her to remember tomorrow. She stirred a little, nodding her head as if in reply to what I'd said, and then she slipped quickly into a deep sleep. I got up and took a long, very hot shower. When I finished, I walked down the hall to the guest room and lay down on the bed. Sherry had not moved when I walked past our bedroom. Her bedroom door, now, I doubt she knew I wasn't there. She was sleeping on the wet spot, something that she did not like. She would be irritated when she woke up the next morning. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. I knew what the coming day would bring, and I dreaded it even as I welcomed it, knowing it would bring me release from the demons that had haunted me for the last month. The next morning, I was dressed and gone before Sherry woke up. I didn't doubt she was upset by my unexplained absence, but I had no desire to be around her. It was too painful. 3 hours after she left, I was back at the house with a U-Haul truck. I'd already delivered the camera to my attorney's office, and one of his assistants had printed 2 copies of everything. The sympathy the young woman felt when she brought them back into the inner office was evident in her eyes. I appreciated it, I guess, but I was suspicious there might have been some pity there too. I didn't want pity. At home again, and after a couple of cups of coffee, I got busy packing up my clothing and the few personal possessions I had brought to the marriage. There were even fewer items we bought together I wanted to keep. While one of my original goals had been to salvage some of the furniture for my own use, I found I didn't want anything more than the DVD player, a 25-inch TV, and a few music CDs. Nothing else caught my eye. I made a backup of everything on the computer, opened the case, and disconnected the backup hard drive. I put it in my briefcase. I'd buy another computer somewhere to put it in before I left. I scattered a dozen prints of the pictures I'd taken last Friday night on the top of her dresser. I used the computer one final time to print my darling wife a short note in the biggest font I could use and still fit the whole text on the page. "Enjoy the memories of last night, dear. They're the last you'll have of me." This was the second childish thing I'd done in the last 4 days, and didn't get any good feelings from this one in the cold light of morning, as it were. But I'd worked hard last night for the opportunity to say this to her, and I wasn't going to back down now. Taping the message to the mirror, I turned around and left what had been our bedroom, down the hall and out the garage door. I didn't bother locking the place up. It was no longer my responsibility. I thought once divorce papers had been served on Sherry, our attorneys would talk and work out the division of our property and other assets. Then I figured we'd sign the paperwork, go before the judge, and it would all be over with. Silly me. It seemed discussions between attorneys were necessarily a long, drawn-out process that became negotiations about the most inconsequential of things. For instance, I know the lawyers spent one whole lunch hour, I paid for it, I'm sure, on the question of whether I should return the TV I had taken with me or did it constitute my share of the electronic equipment in the house. Who gave a flying, well, anyway, it was taking forever. What it finally all boiled down to was that the house and all the furnishings were to be sold, and the proceeds divided equally after the lawyers got their share, of course. Sherry and I would identify any furniture or other things in the home that we particularly wanted, and if the other didn't protest, that item was theirs, up to a total value of $5,000. I didn't care, I'd already made my selection. I told my attorney just to get on with it. A few weeks after the petition for divorce was filed, but before our first court date, I went over to Cal and Melissa's house to see if I could get some answers to the question of how this whole thing started. Melissa had been Sherry's best friend in college, and I'd known Cal slightly over the past few years. We had all become very close. Melissa had become as good a friend of mine as she was Sherry's. I realized belatedly that Cal and Melissa had not come to our house, nor had they invited us to theirs since the Vegas trip. Thinking of how Connie had spoken of Vegas, I wanted to see if Cal and Melissa could shed any light on the problem. They were outside in the backyard when I arrived. When I rang the doorbell, Cal came around the side of the house and escorted me back, handing me a cold beer before having me sit in the shade of a big pecan tree that was growing in the far corner of their yard. We sat for a couple of awkward moments. So I said finally, Melissa burst into tears and got up to run in the house. Cal and I stared at the door through which she disappeared and then at each other. "She's a little emotional sometimes," Cal muttered. "I know," I said, smiling a little. In spite of all the pain everyone was feeling, Melissa was upfront in everything she did, and I loved her for it. In many ways, she was closer to me than my deceased sister ever had been. I took a long swallow of Coors Finest. "Ron," Kel said at length, "Melissa and I are just as sorry as we can be that you and Sherry are breaking up, but we didn't know what to do, you know?" I looked at him questioningly. I could see comprehension spreading across his face. "You don't know," he said. I shook my head. He got 2 more beers from the ice chest beside him and handed one to me. "We didn't know whether to tell you when we got back from Vegas or not," he remarked sadly. "We thought that surely Sherry would tell you what happened, it couldn't be kept hidden." And after a while, it seemed she had, and the two of you had everything all worked out. "Worked what out?" I asked quietly. Cal took a deep breath and spent the next 20 minutes explaining how Sherry had gotten sloppy drunk the first night in Vegas. Tired and mad because I'd had to cancel at the last minute, Sherry had told the other 2 couples that if I wasn't going to be there when she needed me, she was going to find someone who would be. Sherry spent the rest of the night gulping down hard liquor while dancing and flirting with every man who caught her eye. At some point, Sherry and some blonde guy managed to disappear, even with both of the other couples trying hard to keep track of where Sherry and the guy went in the casino. No one saw Sherry until the next day. That afternoon, Saturday, Melissa and Connie had gone to Sherry's room and hammered on the door until Sherry finally answered. She looked like she'd been rode hard and put up wet, according to what Melissa had told Cal. The blonde guy had been in the bathroom but had come out. Sherry had been defensive but also drunk and defiant. The guy had acted completely unconcerned about the whole thing. He left eventually, but since Sherry didn't join Melissa, Cal, Connie, and Tom that Saturday evening, they were pretty sure Sherry and the unknown man had hooked up again. Actually, other than that one meeting Saturday afternoon, none of the 4 saw Sherry until late Sunday afternoon when she showed up at the airport to board the flight home. They hadn't seen how she got to the terminal, so they couldn't say her boyfriend had brought her. They hadn't cared. I didn't blame them. Melissa had come back outside wiping her eyes and was standing behind my chair with her hands on the tops of my shoulders. Every so often, she would pat me as one consoles an unhappy child. I'm not so sure that wasn't exactly what I was at that moment. When Kel finished, I sat looking into space. I wish you told me, I said after a while. I don't know what good it would have done, but some of the lying and the cheating might not have occurred. I sighed and bit my lip, but the damage had already been done. I guess it wouldn't have made any difference in the long run. How did you find out about Vegas? Melissa asked gently. I craned my neck back to look up at her. You'll just told me, I replied. She was confused. Well, how did you find out then? She asked. I took her hand in mine and patted it gently. I saw them in Sherry's car on the street a few weeks ago, and that blonde guy had his hand up her skirt so far I knew he had to have his fingers inside her, I said truthfully. Both their faces blanched, they winced in sympathy. Oh, you poor man, Melissa said. What a horrible way to find out. I shrugged. I'm not sure there is a good way, Liz, I said, but it's over and done with now. I looked down at the grass about my feet so I wouldn't have to admit to the sting of tears that had suddenly rushed to my eyes. Sherry had evidently come over to tell them of the divorce a few days ago. Melissa said Sherry had been mad as hell that Melissa wouldn't support her. It had been just a horrible mistake, according to Sherry, when Melissa had called her a hussy and some other things. Sherry had left in a huff. That was my Sherry all right, blame everyone but the two people who committed the adultery. Cal, Melissa, and I talked for another hour or so before I left. Their 18-month-old baby needed attention, and I wouldn't have been good company at dinner. But they tried hard to get me to stay. 3 months into the negotiations, the question of the pictures I'd taken of Sherry and Blondie came up. Sherry was afraid I was going to put them on the internet. I thought their suggestion was a good one, and I started to look for a website that would handle them. I offered to send copies to everyone at Sherry's office and all her friends too. I didn't intend to do that, but it sure got the talks moving again. There would have been some legal complications if I tried to do as I threatened. For one thing, there was the invasion of privacy thing, since I had taken the pics through the motel window and without permission from the motel or the participants. I told my attorney I'd go ahead and chance a lawsuit if something didn't happen real soon. The next day, Sherry's lawyer reopened the question of how to divide the house and offered me 60% of the sale price if I would turn over all copies of the pictures. But I refused. After a while, they offered 55% of the proceeds if I would agree to keep only one copy of the pictures and agree that I would never transmit them over the internet in any way. Oh, and by the way, Sherry demanded a closed-door meeting between just the two of us. I made a counteroffer of 60%, I'd keep only one set of prints, no digital copies, and a maximum of 30 minutes with her. We eventually settled on the 60% of the house, 2 sets of the pictures, one for me and one, surprisingly, for Sherry, no digital copies, and a 1-hour closed-door meeting. They withdrew all of their motions before the court and agreed to a no-fault divorce at the earliest possible moment. A court order was obtained, recognizing Sherry and me were no longer living together as man and wife, pending a final divorce decree. Texas does not have legal separations, and this was as close as the attorneys could get to one. It was fine with me, the sale of the residence and furnishings could move forward, the mandatory wait time for the divorce would not be interrupted, and things would be over in another 2 months. Meanwhile, I'd made a particularly strong effort to keep my divorce from affecting my job. In fact, I took refuge in my work. I was the first one to arrive in the morning and the last to leave at night. Maybe because he noticed my renewed dedication to the firm, the big boss made me the interim director for the R&D branch. He gave me all the problems to solve, but none of the pay increase for that position. I didn't care that much, I just made sure the disaster of my personal life never hurt my professional career. I got there about 10 minutes early. I had thought the traffic would be heavy and make me late, but it was not to be. The meeting between Sherry and me was to take place in a temporarily vacant office in my attorney's suite. I was hustled into that office, and they ushered me into the big chair behind the desk. That would have a considerable psychological impact on Sherry. They said it would put her at a disadvantage. One of my lawyer's legal aides, the young woman who'd been so sympathetic when I'd initiated the divorce papers, fussed over me for a few minutes, straightening my tie and brushing at some imaginary lint. She leaned very close to me as I sat there. I could smell her perfume, and if I'd let my eyes fall from hers, I'd have had a superb view down her open neck blouse. When everyone else had left the room to greet the arriving party with my wife, she impulsively kissed my forehead, told me to hang in there, and squeezed my hand encouragingly. Standing, she turned and walked through the doorway, but she looked back and smiled before she disappeared. When everyone was gone, I got up and moved to a seat at the short conference table that butted up against the front of the big desk. I didn't think I needed any prompts or artificial barriers. My wife had committed adultery, I caught her, and I was getting rid of her. I didn't see things as any more complicated than that. When Sherry came in, she found me sitting there calmly, placing 5x7 prints on the table of her and her blonde sex toy hammering away at each other on the hotel bed. I was going for neat rows of 6 pictures in each row, but the photos tended to slide on the slick tabletop. It was a lot of effort to make each line of pics line up. I worked while Sherry settled herself. When I looked up, there was a flush across her face. She was an attractive woman, not beautiful in the classical sense, but more than just pretty. I knew that under the bulky sweater top and knee-length dark blue skirt, there was a very exciting body. I looked into the face I'd loved for more than 6 years we'd been together, 4 of them as a married couple. She'd been so warm and affectionate through most of those 6 years. Looking at her now, I couldn't say when the woman I used to know had disappeared or where she'd gone. "You got me really good, didn't you?" she said bitterly, interrupting my train of thought. Her face was twisted into a mask of irritation, something I'd come to expect from her more often than not lately. "I'll bet you're so proud of yourself, aren't you?" I snorted. The puff of air moved 3 prints sideways, and I urged them back into place with a fingernail. "No," I said quietly, "you got yourself." I told her. I glanced up to see her still glaring at me. She opened her mouth to say something I figured would be spiteful. I beat her to the punch. And no, I am definitely not proud of having caught a 304 cheating around on me. I thought the woman I was married to would never, ever screw some strange man. Exactly why would you think I'd be proud to find out differently, huh? It took the wind out of her sails, and she sat with a blank expression on her face. For a time, I held up my left forearm and checked my watch as ostentatiously as I could. "I was told you wanted to talk to me, so talk. We've got just about 55 minutes left." I leaned back in my chair. I was tired of playing with the pictures. Sherry made an effort to keep her eyes from straying to the pictures and look only at me. She took a deep breath. "Ron, honey, whoa, back up there," I said quickly. She pulled back, surprised at my vehemence. "You don't have any right to call me honey, sugar, or sweetheart, or anything else," I told her. "You gave that up when you started playing with your little sex toy in Vegas." She flinched and swallowed hard. She couldn't meet my eyes, but she couldn't look at the pics either. The wall behind me was suddenly getting her complete attention. "I didn't mean to step over any boundaries here," she said finally. "Okay," I said. "Just so we understand each other." She nodded. "Ron," she paused and looked at me, expecting me to object again. "I guess." "Ron," she continued, "first, I want to say I'm so sorry about all this. I never meant to hurt you, you've got to believe that." "I don't have to believe any such thing," I retorted. "What the hell would make you think you could cheat around behind my back and not have it hurt me?" She looked at me for a long moment. "I never meant for you to find out," she said in a low voice. "And if you hadn't found out, you wouldn't have been hurt." I snorted disbelievingly. "What? No harm, no foul, Sherry? Either you are pretty damn stupid, or you think I am. From what our friends are telling me, you were dry humping this guy on the dance floor and in the casino. You went off somewhere they couldn't find you and didn't manage to corner you until the next afternoon. Sex toy was there in your room with you, and you didn't even try to hide it. Just how the hell did you think you were going to keep me from finding out eventually?" She sat looking at me without saying anything for a bit. "Then why didn't you stop me?" she asked sharply. "What?" I said. "I wasn't there, Sherry." She shook her head. "When we came back, why didn't you say something?" Why didn't you stop me from seeing him again? She was getting worked up, but I couldn't understand what she was talking about. Why didn't you fight for me? You're supposed to love me, she blurted. I shook my head in confusion. This was hard enough without her talking in riddles. Sherry, I said wearily, I didn't know what you were doing. How could I stop you? Read your mind? Then it struck me. Oh, Sherry, Melissa and Cal didn't tell me about Vegas until I'd already caught you with your sex toy. She winced at my repeated description of the blonde guy, but I wasn't in any mood to be gentle. You want to know how I caught you? I asked challengingly. She nodded, a small tear at the corner of her left eye. I saw you and sex toy while I was sitting in a van at a stoplight, I said shortly. He had his hand so far up your skirt, I'm surprised his fingers weren't coming out of your mouth, I told her. Her posture changed from one that had been aggressive, she slumped into one of despair and pain. I waited. I'd said my piece. I am so sorry you saw that, Ron, she said finally. I'm sorry I let him do it. I'm sorry all of this happened. You sure didn't look like you were sorry that day, I told her. In fact, you looked like you were having a ball, I said, no pun intended. She cringed in her seat before straightening up. I came here to be honest with you, and I'm going to do it, she said. I was enjoying it, she said. God help me, I was, but no more than I would have if it were my fingers in there, or, a dildo, she said. But they weren't your fingers, Sherry, I said softly. It wasn't a dildo, and they sure as hell weren't my fingers. They were his, and his had no damn business being there. I slammed my hand down on the polished tabletop, my open palm making a loud smacking thud that echoed off the law books and the shelves all around. I had an exclusive rights contract with you, Sherry, I said. It's called a marriage. No one else in this whole world had any right to put his hands down there except me, damn it to hell. I sat back, trembling with anger, fighting to keep my temper from exploding. The 24 pictures on the table had all skittered across the surface of the table. To occupy my hands and mind, I began picking them up and placing them in a neat stack in front of me. I'm sorry, Ron, she said after a while. You're right. I should not have done anything with that man. I know that. I don't have any excuses at all. For the first time today, I agree with you, I said, cutting off whatever she was going to say. Yeah, she said. I know. She took a deep breath. Ron, would it make any difference if I told you that the night you took all these pictures, I told him I wasn't going to see him anymore? I glanced up from my pile of photos. She held my eyes with her own. I shrugged. No, not a hell of a lot, I said evenly. She was startled. She thought she had something important to throw into the mix. Sherry, you cheated on me in Las Vegas, right in front of our friends. When you came home, you didn't come to me and tell me about it. And then you drilled him 3, 4, 5, a dozen times more here in our town. You didn't stop when you came home. What's that saying? What goes on in Vegas stays in Vegas. Boy, that sure didn't apply to you, did it? Not one damn bit. Hell, you were like that Energizer bunny, you just kept going and going and going. You know what, Sherry? I've been told cheating gets easier every time you do it. Apparently, it is. You sure didn't seem to have any trouble finding places and times to drill your blonde guy. I doubt you would have ever stopped if I hadn't nailed you with some really good pictures and then filed for divorce. I looked up from my mount of pics. You tell me you weren't going to see him anymore, but to put it bluntly, I don't believe you, I told her emphatically. I think you're lying through your teeth. It's true, she snapped. Right after we went into the room, I told him this would be our last time. I'd already decided to stop seeing him. I was feeling guilty and ashamed, and I wanted to end it. She reached out, snagged one of the pictures, and held it up in front of my eyes. You see this? She demanded. He's trying to hurt me here, slamming into me really hard. He was punishing me for telling him I wasn't going to be with him anymore. A little bit after you took this, I got away and kicked him in the balls. I shook my head. I didn't want to see what she was trying to show me, and it really didn't matter. It looks to me like you're getting a little rough sex there, and you were liking it, I said. I held up my hand to stop her from saying something. But let's say you're telling the gospel truth. I lean. Ed on my elbows, partly across the table. If it's true you wanted to stop screwing him, Sherry, why the hell didn't you give him a call and tell him? Why was it necessary to give him a goodbye sex? She hung her head. I know it was wrong, but... Don't bother, Sherry. I don't want to hear it. Even if I accepted what you say at face value, I don't believe, and I never will believe, that you would ever have stopped so long as your dirty secret life was still a secret from me. Oh, you might mean what you say. You might have even done it for a week, a month, 6 months, maybe. But you'd have gone back to him or found someone else the first damn time you got pissed off at me again, or you had car trouble, or when you had a bad hair day. Sooner or later, you'd have had that urge to get a little strange and pay me back for every real and imaginary problem we've ever had, wouldn't you? Isn't that what you were doing, Shia? I had become agitated once more. I had to back off. I sat back in my chair, trying to look as cool as I felt. Sherry was sobbing once more. She whispered, "You don't have to talk to me like that. I'm your wife." I said harshly. I looked away in disgust. Not for very long. Okay, Sherry, you're sorry. I'm sorry too. Hell, everybody involved in this damn mess is sorry. So what? Where does that get us? For a while we sat in silence. I tapped my chest and said, "Sherry, you've ripped the heart right out of me. Right here, there's a big hole, a whole lot of emptiness inside me where I used to keep the image of a woman I loved more than life itself. A woman I trusted with my most private secrets, someone I could count on to be good to me when the whole world was against me. You were my friend, someone I could talk to, trade opinions about anything under the sun. You were my lover, the one woman in the world I would ever make love to for the rest of my life, and the only woman I wanted to make love to me. You took that all away, and I can't get it back." I stated this in a couple of sentences. Sherry's tears had intensified. "Ron," I cut her off. "Sherry, you've half killed me, screwed that guy, betrayed me, betrayed yourself, and betrayed our marriage," I said, speaking slowly and deliberately. I inhaled deeply. That was true. An investigator working for my attorney had located the garage that had dispatched a wrecker to retrieve 2 sets of slashed tires from a motel, take them back to the shop for repair, return the tires to the motel, and mount them on 2 vehicles. I sure hope whatever you got out of it was worth wrecking our marriage, because I heard this morning his wife kicked him out and is filing for divorce too. The owners of the cars, according to the wrecker driver, were a calm blonde man and an enraged brunette woman. The license plate number of the vehicle in question was included in each of the billing reports, and once he had that, the investigator could easily determine the man's name and other personal details. After learning the man's identity from my attorney, I tracked down his home phone number and spoke with his wife. When I told her what I knew, she became furious. I wasn't shocked that she had also filed for divorce. It seemed odd that when Sherry left her room, there had really been 3 teenagers who had escaped from the motel. I knew they hadn't done the tires, but they might have been up to no good elsewhere. For a while, I watched my wife cry uncontrollably. She was no longer my woman, she was a stranger, even though I wanted to embrace her. "Will you tell me why you did it?" I replied. She needed a long time to stop crying and regain self-control. I wanted to see if Melissa could add anything to what she and Cal had told me about her time in Las Vegas. "I'm not sure, Ron," she uttered somewhat sourly. "It's like a whole other world out there. It didn't feel real from the minute I got off the plane. Then I got drunk, the lights were so bright, it was like they hypnotized me. You weren't there, and I was mad you wouldn't come with me. Then, he was talking to me so nice, telling me how sad it was that I was alone. After a while, I just gave in, Ron." The final sentence was screamed rather than spoken. I felt disdain for her when I first looked at her. "Well, that's just..." I uttered, struggling to articulate my feelings to her. I gave up expecting them to show up. I finally let out, "Goddamn it, none of that is any excuse." First of all, I had to go to Denver and fix that damn glitch in the proposed power delivery system. If I hadn't gone, I'd have been fired. And if I didn't have a job, we couldn't make the payments on that nice big house you just had to have a couple years back. I couldn't be with you in Vegas, damn it, it wasn't a matter of not wanting to. Don't you think I would have if I could? What else was it? Oh yeah, you got drunk. Well, excuse the hell out of me, sugar pie honey bunch, but who the hell told you to get drunk in the first place? Are you a child that someone has to take a glass of rum out of your hands when you shouldn't be drinking it? Screw you, you had no business even thinking of getting drunk if you can't control who you let shove meat up your damned holes when you do. Bright lights hypnotized, what the hell does that mean, Sherry? Should everyone treat you like you had some kind of mental problem because you might be hypnotized by the pretty lights? Give me a break. I leaned heavily on my chair's left arm and inhaled deeply. Then she said something else that infuriated me once more. I straightened my back and leaned in her direction across the table. And you said he was talking to you real nice, isn't that just precious? You're an attractive woman, Sherry, of course, men are going to come onto you. So what? Who the goddamned hell told you a married woman has a right to even think about letting some strange guy console you and flatter you and tell you how rotten it was that your husband wasn't there, huh? That's what he did, didn't he, Sherry? He told you I was a sorry son of a witch for not being there for you, didn't he? She nodded and used a wet tissue to dab at some of her tears. Yeah, I shook my head in disgust, and you laughed it up, didn't you, with contempt? Damn it, Sherry, you talked about being drunk and drinking. You were married, a married woman, or man, hell, it applies to all of us. The fact is, you were supposed to act like you were a recovering alcoholic. I mean, that a married person is like someone who can never touch alcohol ever. But you did, you know what? The first time you danced with him too close, the first time you let him touch your arm in a possessive way, you were an alcoholic breaking your vow and never touch the stuff. Our marriage vows said we would forsake all others, Sherry, forsake all others. What the hell did you not understand about that? Do you think I'm so ugly and unattractive, so inept in bed, that I couldn't have been doing what you did? Don't you understand, I get chances to spend a night or two with strange women every single time I go on a trip. Damn it, I have to travel 7 or 8 times a year, and every place I go, there's a secretary in the office, a professional woman from down the hall, a waitress in a restaurant, or a woman in the hotel bar where I go for a nightcap. Maybe it's just a girl I pass in the corridor going to my room, but every time I go somewhere, there's a woman who I might be able to have sex with. But you know what? I never have. I've been propositioned 10 times, I mean, by 10 women, this last year alone, I think, and I've never even given one of them a second's worth of consideration because I had my loving woman at home. Guess you fooled me, huh? I said bitterly. If only I'd known. I gave a disgusted shake of my head. For a long while, the only sound in the room was crying. She knelt down and continued to cry, not wanting me to see her trembling shoulders. I was talking most of the time, and I wasn't sure why Sherry had wanted to talk to me. I resumed, ending the protracted quiet. Sherry, you should never have allowed that man to touch you at all, I retorted. The first time he did, and you let him get away with it, you took a swallow from the cup that you could never drink from if you wanted to stay married to me. The first time you let him kiss you, you did it again. The second he put his hand on your body, oh, hell, what's the point? I realized that I had to stop talking about this topic because it was killing me. Suddenly, I felt no more anger. I sagged into my chair and made an effort to breathe deeply. Finally, I said, I don't know what else there is to say, Sherry. I just know you've ruined something that was really beautiful. You know that? Now, I don't have anything but pain, and it won't go away. I loved you with all my being, hell, I still love you. I guess I haven't learned how to turn it off yet and then back on like a faucet the way you have. When Sherry saw me shaking my head, she stopped talking. Ron, she said hesitantly. If you can still love me, we could try again. But you made love to me so good that Sunday before you left me, she sobbed, confusedly shaking her head. Not at all, I snapped back. I wasn't making love to you that night, Sherry, I was drilling you and making you come over and over so you'd remember it when I left. I'm sorry I did it now, it was a mean thing to do, something childish, arrogant, and worthless. I'm sorry I did it. Sherry appeared stunned, then horrified. She had placed her hopes on my desire to want to be with her again. For a while, we sat there staring at one another. Oh, and no, I'm not allowed to try again, I uttered after recalling the query. Finally, I said, Sherry, I don't have anything left to try with. I don't believe a word you say. I know for a fact that you've lied through your teeth every day since you started screwing that a-hole. You were deceiving me every minute of every day, and that's one cruel, heartless thing to do to someone who loves you. I can't possibly trust you anymore, Sherry. I can't imagine ever trusting you again out of my sight. I can't live that way, Sherry, I said, leaning my head back on the back of the chair and staring at the ceiling tiles. Thinking to myself, I don't know what I did to deserve this, Sherry, I said. Based on that last night of sex we had together, I seem to be able to satisfy you sexually. If I can't, you're one hell of an actress, I never saw so many fake orgasms all strung together that night if that's what you were doing. I kept quiet for a while, trying to sort everything out in my head. You know, Sherry, I know I'm not perfect. I don't always see when you're unhappy about something, sometimes I don't pick up on your signals quick enough. I know there are times you want to talk to me, and I'm wrapped up in something else and I don't understand. There are times I don't have a clue what it is you want me to do, and I've never learned how to talk to you when you're mad. But right off the top of my head, I've never shut myself off from you. I try to be considerate even if I don't succeed all the time. Hell, I only watch one football game a week on TV just to make room for a little extra time with you on weekends. I take you out when we can afford it, I bring you flowers or a little something every so often. I guess I don't do everything I could, but I try. I guess there are a lot of times I'm not the man I'd like to be, but what the goddamn hell did I ever do to you to make you do something like this? Nothing. Nothing at all, Ron, Sherry spoke quickly. It was just me, all right? I did something incredible, and stupid, and spiteful, and I'm sorry for having hurt you. I'm so ashamed, and I feel so unclean that I did those things with him, Ron. I feel guilty all the time now. I wish so bad that I could go back and stop myself, but I can't, Ron. I can't push some undo button and make it all go away. I wish I could, she said quietly. For now, I suppose she was all cried out. I can't keep from wondering, Sherry, I said with a whispered voice, when did you make the decision that you could have sex with him and it would be all right? And how did you make a decision like that, huh? What made it okay in your mind to use sex with someone else to solve a problem you had with me, huh? In the same voice, she said, I never made a decision to do any of that, Ron. If I had been making decisions, I wouldn't have made this bad a mistake. It just happened. I didn't want it, I didn't go looking for it, she stated. That was it, I could take no more. I sat up straight in my chair and began patting and gathering the pictures into a tidy stack. I had had enough of the justifications. I retorted, no, it didn't just happen. Come on, Sherry, you weren't just walking through the casino that night and suddenly find a strange meat sticking out of your holes. No, sir, Bob, that's not what happened. You let this happen. Hell, Sherry, let's be frank here, you made it happen. After you got back home, and by the way, you damn sure did want it, and you most emphatically did go looking for it, at least here in the town we live in, even if I believe you when you say you didn't in Vegas. Take a little responsibility for this, Sherry, this wasn't a lightning bolt coming out of a clear sky. You did it, you liked it, and you kept on doing it, period. I guess, I said, and it wasn't a mistake either, as she simply stared at me in shock. A mistake is when you reach for a can of tomato soup on a supermarket shelf and you come away with mushroom instead. Hell, this is more like the mother of all catastrophes. I guess that's just the way it's going to have to be, Sherry, I replied. I can't live with a woman I can't trust. They don't have chastity belts anymore, and I wouldn't lock you in one if they did. If I have to worry every time I leave your side that you're going to be screwing some guy when I'm out of sight, well, I'd rather just get out of the situation. I'll leave you to every Tom, Dick, or Harry you want to screw, or do all three of them at one time, for all I care. I put the pictures in my inside jacket pocket and stood up. I don't have anything else to say, Sherry, and the time we agreed to talk on is almost over. Do you have anything you need to say to me? She stood over the table and gave me a direct look. Just one thing, Ron, and then you can go if that's what you want. I just thought I could explain to you what happened and see if we could find a way through this. I quickly grabbed one of the images out of my coat pocket. I showed it to her, holding it by one corner. Sherry, I don't need an explanation. This is it. This is what happened. This one photo tells me everything I need to know. If it didn't, what Cal and Melissa told me would have done the job sooner or later. I don't understand where you're coming from. Don't you get it? When you went up to your room in Las Vegas with that man and closed the hotel door behind you, you shut me out of your life. You killed the marriage with just that one act. All the rest of it is just piled on top of more. There is nothing you can explain away. The facts are the facts, and nothing on God's green earth is going to change them. I don't know what else I can say. She appeared to muster one last ounce of bravery and said, well, how about if I say there is no explanation that will change a damn thing? Does that make it any clearer? She totally disregarded everything I had just said in the process. She most likely didn't comment on it, I suppose. Ron, I love you, and I will always love you. I want you to remember that, she replied. I've been selfish, petty. I've screwed things up bad, but I won't ever stop loving you. Can you understand that, Ron? I gave a nod. I gave a shrug. There was no doubt in my mind that she felt she did, standing here with me in this room right now. If love was that adaptable to allow her to do what she'd done, then it was an awfully one-dimensional, self-serving kind of love. I turned my back on the woman who had been my wife and pulled my jacket across my shoulders so that it fit better. Ron, I'm out. Sorry. With a muttered yeah, I know, I avoided her gaze. Neither she nor I said anything further. I walked out the door and Sherry made no attempt to touch me. I was relieved because I knew that whatever emotion she harbored for me on a deep, secret level would never surface again. My love for her remained unchanged from the day I got married. This was beyond the power of love, she denigrated our union. It was best to leave me behind because there was nothing left in me to salvage. I closed the door behind me, not making a loud echo boom noise in the hallway, but shutting it firmly. After 7 months, I was set free. I'm still employed there. Sherry relocated to a new city after leaving her hometown. I haven't started dating, and I don't plan to do so anytime soon. Please feel free to express your opinions in the space provided for comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.